Are all large language models basically the same? Maybe, maybe not. In this episode of Today in Tech, we're going to explore some of the highs and lows for different LLMs and why the space has changed dramatically over the past 2 years. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Today in Tech. I'm Keith Shaw. Joining me on the show today is Vikram Chatterjee. He is the co-founder and CEO at Galileo, which conducts generative AI observability and helps companies build more trustworthy Gen AI applications. Welcome to the show, Vikram.
Hey Keith, thank you so much for having me.
So you guys, I don't want to talk about this too much, but you put out this thing called the Hallucination Index. I think that's how I was originally pitched to talk about this. But quickly, so you're monitoring how different LLMs and different AI platforms are doing in the world of hallucinations, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct.
And
exactly.
Are you finding that they're getting better at it, or is it about the same, or are they getting worse?
They're actually getting much better at it. But the thing which we really wanted to point out with the index was it's not that they're all getting better at the same time across all different kinds of task types. And that's what we wanted to point out. It's similar to how one car might be good for the road, the other one might be good for the dirt.
Right.
It's you have to choose your model wisely based on what you're trying to do. So this index was supposed to be not an academic index like a lot of others are there, which are not very helpful for the practitioner, but instead a much more practical index, which doesn't just look at accuracy, but also looks at cost as well as latency across many different kinds of task types. So people can come in and actually figure out what they relate to most, and then figure out, should I go with an OpenAI model, which can be expensive, or should I go with the latest Llama model, which is much less expensive, but could work well for them.
All right, so to quickly answer the question that I had at the top of the show, I would assume that you would say that all large language models are not the same, whereas someone maybe off the street looks at them and goes, they all seem the same, let's just pick one. So
Exactly.
so I'm assuming that they're not. And so what would the main parameters that companies need to look at when they are evaluating one of these large language models? And again, they probably have a specific idea in mind of what they want to accomplish, but you've got about 5 different parameters that companies really need to take a look at. So do you want to go through some of those, and I can ask questions on those as well?
For sure, yeah. So at Galileo, I've had this privilege of having to talk to hundreds of different enterprise customers almost every month, and what we've been seeing is folks use RAG, or retrieval augmented generation, quite a lot, where they just have a bunch of documents that they're referencing, and the model has a bunch of knowledge, but it's referencing those, let's say, legal documents, and trying to figure out how do I answer this question based on the document and the context I have. And so because we saw such a huge proliferation of RAG, we decided to focus the hallucination index on just that. And within that, there were a couple of different parameters and slices that we wanted to create for the practitioner. So some of them were, number one, open source versus closed source, right? Just to look at how one does versus the other. The other one was looking at cost as a factor. Because even if it's closed source, some of them are expensive, some of them not so much, right? And the third one was from a RAG perspective. A lot of these models are good with smaller documents or smaller sized documents, and some of them are very good with larger sized documents. So as an example, in my example before, legal documentation, huge documents there, right? So you might need a model which is specifically good for what's called large context. Versus if you're building a simple chatbot for customer service where the questions can be very short, you might not need that large context model. You just need a small context model. Right. Divided by these different kinds of slices to tell the practitioner that, hey, for your specific use case, maybe you can do with this other model, which is much cheaper and also much more accurate than the other model. So to your point, not all models are the same. They're just I think of them as cars in my head. They're not all the same. You've got to look under the hood. You've got to figure out what's good for you.
Right. And would you say now that a lot of companies that are exploring AI projects, or the ones that are coming to you and talking to you about your abilities, is retrieval augmented generation, is that now table stakes for many of these companies? Like, they're already coming in knowing that they've got specific documents that they want in this database, and they're not just looking to deploy like a large GPT or a general one. Are they coming to you
Exactly.
with specific documents and data?
Exactly. The
Yeah.
level of maturity for these companies has definitely gone higher. And so what we're seeing is people want to personalize these large language models towards their use case. Now, RAG is one mechanism to do that. The other one is just to take an open source model and fine tune that with their own data. So there's multiple ways to make sure that a model is much more attuned to their use case. But 100%, we're seeing people come to us with a very strong opinion about like, look, we have the context data or we have the fine-tuned model, and we also have a lot of the other pieces that are necessary for developing an AI application.
Yeah.
Instead of maybe a year and a half ago when people were coming to us, they were just like, we have a model, we have a prompt, we're good to go. That it's not the case anymore. It's a bit more, it's more nuanced than that. People
Right.
are building more complex agents now, as an example.
Now on the flip side, as you're evaluating the LLMs in this space, are most of them, do they have that ability to work within that RAG-based model, or are you still seeing some out there that can't do it or don't do it as well?
Well, it starts to depend so most of these models, they can work pretty well with RAG-based capabilities. There are some that work better than the others, because in order to, again, work really well with RAG, you have to have a pretty large context window for the model. Some of the open source models don't have a huge context window, and that becomes a limiting factor for them. Where some of the larger ones, like the recent ones from Anthropic, or the model from Gemini, they have a massive context window. You could literally add multiple books in there, but at the same time, it comes at a price. As an example, Gemini launched a model called Flash, which is great, but it has a smaller context window, versus Anthropic has this model called Sonnet. Flash is $1 for 1,000,000 tokens. Sonnet is $15 for 1,000,000 tokens. So it's 15x the price.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as a practitioner, you have to question whether, for the same RAG-based use case, should I be using Flash or should I be using Sonnet? I shouldn't just be going after the bright and shiny object just because I'm, I don't know, a large enterprise with a ton of budget and everyone's talking about generative AI. That doesn't mean I should go for the most expensive thing out there.
Yeah.
It might not be necessary.
When you started monitoring a lot of these platforms and these LLMs, there were probably not a lot available. Do you know how many were around when you started watching this, and then how many do you have now, if you can give a sense of the scale?
Amongst the large language models?
Yeah.
In general.
Yeah.
Well, I would say like in the beginning, there was definitely fewer. Like instead of numbers, I could give you maybe like a rough
Sure, that's
magnitude.
fine.
It's probably, I would say like at least 10x now compared to back then, right? But which is another issue for the practitioner where they get super confused.
Right.
And so it's just the ones with the biggest brand name or the ones with the most amount of money from investors that's actually catching the eyeballs, which was another reason we wanted to do this, because what we realized was there were some models like Alibaba's model, it's called Qwen, that actually did almost as well as some of the models from Meta, but people don't talk about it as much. And so there's definitely that other issue of there being way too many LLMs these days that are being produced from the ground up, but not all of them are equal, and some of them are way better than the other
Yeah.
ones.
Did that growth surprise you in seeing how quickly a lot of these LLMs came out? Or was it expected given how much hype was around generative AI and you just seeing like everyone jump on the wagon?
I wasn't that surprising to me, and honestly, because I spent like, almost a decade at Google before starting the company, and at Google I was working very closely with the team that built out one of the first large language models. Now it's a much smaller language model in comparison. It's called BERT. This was from the team that wrote the Transformers paper, which started this whole revolution. And what we saw with BERT was open source. And what we saw with BERT was it immediately led to this proliferation of a bunch of different kinds of BERT models, as well as other kinds of language models as well. And the reason for that, Keith, was that it turned out that was super helpful for users. And whenever there's a ton of value for a user from something which they could just pick up and use,
Yeah.
they're that market becomes hot, and so people want to be a part of that. The when there's a huge amount of demand, the supply starts to follow. So it wasn't super surprising in this case, especially because when we saw OpenAI's models for ChatGPT starting to do really well, it was, and I would say way more demand for this as compared to BERT and NLP.
Yeah.
I can tell you later on, but when you saw that, it was fairly obvious that this is going to start an entire arms race, and now AWS and Meta
Right,
and everybody
right.
get into this, and that's what's happening.
So like you said, though, but that adds another problem for a lot of companies that are trying to figure out what one to choose when you now, let's say you had, 3 to choose from at the beginning, and now you're seeing 30, like just to use your 10x example.
That's right.
Keeping track of all of that just must be a nightmare for a regular company, which is why companies like your company and some other companies are starting to monitor a lot of these things. But at some point, someone who has to make a decision might just throw up their hands and go, I don't know, let's just pick the popular one or things like that. And that's probably a mistake to do that, right? Like, how much research does a company need to do before they make that decision?
Well, a bit, and because
Yeah.
you have to. I mean, I think of this similarly to how, let's say, like somebody wants to build out in the software engineering world, right? Like, first of all, most people who are building out these AI applications now are engineers. They're not just using Python anymore, which is the language of data scientists. It's more, JavaScript, Java, TypeScript. Those are the languages that people are building AI applications with. And the reason I mention that is because when you're building software applications, when you're looking at the back end of your application, right, you're not necessarily just picking up just about any database. You're actually looking at, should I pick this versus should I pick the other one? What are the requirements of my application? Is it going to be streaming data? Is it going to be batch? There's a bunch of these considerations that you have to make before you figure that out. And so these backend engineers are actually really good at figuring that out because they kind of know, and they're very aware of the market, and they know which ones might make the most sense. And there are a lot of database companies. There was this huge wave in the early 2000 maybe 5 to 2015 timeframe where there were a crazy number of database companies, but some of them stood out because of just the sheer adoption versus some of them did not. I think of it very similarly now, where there are these engineers who have to just keep abreast about, if I want to save cost for shorter context because I'm using RAG, maybe Gemini Flash is the best one to go with. But that being said, what's better about this version, about this stuff now, is you can really quickly experiment across 5 or 6 or 7 different kinds of models just to see what the output quality looks like.
Yeah.
And then try to figure out which one actually makes sense for you. That experimentation still needs to happen. It's still science, it's still data science, but it's just being done by a software engineer.
Right. Now earlier you had mentioned the open source model, which was the Alibaba. That's the Alibaba one, Qwen. That's one of them.
That's right.
In your index, in your latest index, you noticed that that Qwen 1.5 32B chat and Llama 370B chat are rapidly closing the gap on closed source models such as Claude 3.5 Sonnet and Gemini 1.5 Flash. They're improving hallucination performance, and they are also a lower cost. So, can you talk about a little bit about the pros and cons of looking at open source versus closed models? And is it the same kind of attitude that you would see with a lot of companies that may be either for open source? Is it the same as in other kind of technologies where you see open source models versus closed source? And is there still that, hesitancy for a lot of companies to go to an open source model?
Yeah, so there's the thing with closed source models is, so I'm a big personal advocate for open source.
Yeah, most engineers are. We've been finding.
Yeah, but also just as a founder of companies, I like the idea of anybody being able to start stuff, and even if you're just sitting in a part of, even if you're not financially, very, very, very well to do, which you need to be for some of these closed source models, you can still just start a company. You can just call an API and just start this thing. So I like the idea of open source being more proliferant. That being said, closed source, they're throwing money at it. They're increasing the parameter sizes. And so you basically pay for the cost of that IP that they're using with all their engineers. And so that is fairly expensive. So, but that being said, what we're seeing in the enterprise now is people are gravitating more towards closed source today. And I think that's a little bit because they know that although open source is closing the gap, it's not quite there yet. And when these folks are building out serious applications for their business, they don't want to take any chances. They want to just go with the model, even if it means like it's going to cost them like 5x more. They probably want to go for the model which just works better. That being said, we do work with some enterprises who are like the Fortune 50 financial services businesses in the US, some large banks in Europe as well, and they actually pay a huge premium for privacy. And that's a problem with closed source models, where you're basically giving your data and it's going to some other server somewhere within OpenAI, maybe, or it's going to Azure OpenAI, for instance.
Okay.
And there's a little bit of trust that needs to be built out with closed source models for them. And so a lot of these folks basically have a mandate that they are just not going to use any closed source models. They're going to use an open source model. And that's where they try to gravitate towards, let's quickly maybe fine tune these open source models towards our specific use cases, which can also dramatically increase the accuracy of these models anyways.
Okay, so if a company was concerned about the privacy and data, they could use an open source model, but then keep it all in-house, right, and keep it secured. Because it seems like a little bit of an oxymoron where you're using an open source one because it's more private.
It's more closed. It's more private.
It's more closed, at least for the company using it. Interesting point. All right. So do you think that specific types of usage scenarios might lend itself better to an open source model versus a closed source one? I think you already mentioned one with this, the need for security, and you're concerned about how a closed source model might take with privacy, but more in the end user case, like maybe accuracy versus creativity, for example. Do the open source models tend to be more creative or better at creativity, or is it still all over the map?
That's still all over the map,
Yeah.
as in like from a creativity standpoint. But that being said, there are some nuances, right? Like there was a model from Hugging Face, for instance, last year, that we noticed was surprisingly verbose in its responses, right? Like you ask an Anthropic Sonnet model, the same question is probably going to give a very succinct answer, but you ask this other model, it's going to give a huge answer. And so we might want to bias for one versus the other. Open source versus closed source as such, we've not seen that much of a difference. The big differences are, number one, what you mentioned before around the privacy piece. That's been super important. The second one has been the ease of fine tuning, because even fine tuning a closed source model can also be quite expensive. Some of them just don't allow that. But with open source models, they all do by definition allow that to happen. So that's another very big consideration for people to make. And the third one is the big difference, in my opinion, is with the context lens, because the closed source models, they have huge context lens, whereas the open source ones really do not. It can be fairly small.
You're reading my mind, Vikram, because that's my next question. Like you pointed out that a long context length does matter when considering an LLM. Can you explain that a little bit more? I don't understand exactly why the length of a document would affect how the LLM responds. Can you dig a little deeper into that?
Yeah, for sure. Let's see. So think of it this way: like when every model has a certain aperture with which it can actually view the documents. So in order to increase the size of that aperture, it requires a lot more heavy lifting from the model provider side when they're actually building out this model.
Okay.
So Gemini, for instance, spent a lot of money to make sure that their large Gemini model could have a very large aperture for the kind of documents that it's viewing. So what starts to happen as a result of this is when a model's asked a question, let's say, what's the something simple, like what's the capital of France? It's been given a lot of documents related to geography. It's basically going through all of these documents, and then you have a chunking methodology on top of that, where that's part of the RAG process, where you chunk all the documents into smaller and smaller pieces. And now this model basically has to retrieve a bunch of these documents to figure out where the answer is coming from, right? And so in this scenario, the answer is probably like one line somewhere that is trying to figure out the answer from, right? Like there's some line somewhere which says the capital of France is Paris, and maybe before Paris it used to be XYZ, and the model is like, I got my answer, and it's going to say. Now, this doesn't work really well in the context of healthcare or legal sometimes, because in order to get an answer for what was the result of the XYZ case in 1957, right?
Sure.
It has to look at this entire large document and then summarize that for you really quickly. Now, that large document has X number of words in it. The way models think of words is in terms of tokens, and so a lot of these open source models have very few tokens. So it's akin to maybe one paragraph is all it can take. That's the aperture. Whereas some of the larger models have a really large aperture. Like they can take in like 5 or 6 different books as an example. Now, the one difference between since we're talking about open source versus closed source is there are some open source models that are actually closing the gap even here. Like the Qwen model from Alibaba, again, was a really interesting model because it performs really well. It's open source, but it also supports a context length of 128,000 tokens. And so you can actually use that for not just one paragraph, but like maybe an entire couple of pages of documentation. And so we are starting to see that gap starting to close. So you can start to use some of these free models for some of these use cases, which otherwise you could not before.
Okay, and then do you have some examples? Also, I think you were talking about where some smaller models might be outperforming larger models. Do you have any examples of what you mean there, or can show that effect?
Well, I mean, there are some models out. So we are starting to see more and more that smaller models, quote unquote, are being better designed, and so they are starting to outperform larger parameter models, right? Like one good example was the GPT-4o mini model that came out recently. If you compare that even to the GPT 3.5 model that came out previously, it was a larger model from just the size perspective, but GPT-4o mini is dramatically cheaper and more accurate as compared to that. So we are definitely seeing that. So over the arc of even 6 months, we're seeing new models come out with better design, which are dramatically cheaper, but also more accurate than a model which might have just been trained on a much larger amount of data.
Okay, so there was also another thing in your index, your latest index, that said that there are LLMs that are from outside of the U.S., such as Mistral Large and Alibaba's, as you mentioned, that are becoming some emerging players in the space. Are companies hesitant to use non-U.S. based LLMs, or is that just something that maybe they weren't aware of, that there are a lot of you don't necessarily have to just use the popular ones right now, or the big ones from the U.S. Like what should companies realize about all of these emerging global players?
So it's interesting. In the U.S., we've been seeing people. Again, it's a lot about the exposure that they have around the brand names that are of the models that they're seeing, right? So you're seeing a lot of people just go after OpenAI, Anthropic. If it comes to open source, they look at the models from Meta, and they're not really experimenting way beyond that. So even though the Qwen model from Alibaba is really good, they might not be necessarily adopting it straight off the shelf and loving the idea that it's awesome, because they're not hearing their friends use it. That's been our take on this. Because again, there is no like great index to tell them that, hey, the Qwen model is actually pretty good and you should probably consider it because it's cheaper. It's also better. It's also got 128,000 token size. However, outside the US, it's really fascinating because there is a certain sense in certain countries, like the EU likes to use stuff which has been made in the EU. And that's also to just self-regulate and self-protect themselves against the data regulations that are coming up. And so Mistral is hugely popular amongst a lot of the EU companies. Qwen, for instance, is getting really popular in a lot of the APAC based enterprises. So we are starting to see this like almost geography based determination of which model should we go with, just based on their local data privacy laws that are coming up.
Yeah. What is it about an LLM that makes it become more popular? I think you've been using that word a little bit, like,
Yeah.
Is it just word of mouth? Again, I think I try to think back to the early days of the search engine stuff, where a lot of people were using, Boy, search engines like Alta Vista and I think Excite was one of the ones that I was using, and then
Yeah.
everybody started using Google, like
Yeah.
and it spread like wildfire because it was just so much faster than a lot of these other search engines were. Are
Right.
you seeing something similar with AI where or within these LLMs that like, oh well, it's faster or it's more accurate or it's just more fun? I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
what are some of the reasons that some of these are becoming more popular than before, or is it just because it's like, hey, I've got a secret that no one else knows about, and all the cool kids are now using this one?
No, I think your analogy is pretty spot on. I think it is very similar to that. It is a model is a piece of infrastructure though, right? But that being said, people do react to how it responds to certain questions. Because at this point, what's happened, Keith, is people already have a list of, let's say, top 100 questions that they care the most about
Okay.
for their, let's say, 5 use cases that they've now built in production. And amongst those 100 questions that they want to ask the model, they already know that maybe 8 or 10 of them are the model just struggles with. No matter which model comes up, it just struggles with those questions. And then a new model comes out, like the Anthropic model, the Sonnet model. That came out and people threw all these 10 questions at that, and they actually said like, wait, this actually works now. It's being able to give me the answer magically. It's just being able to figure this out. And so that spread like wildfire. So there was this OpenAI moment, there was the Meta moment because it was open source, and then there was this Sonnet moment, I wanna call it, where people were like, this is great. Now OpenAI has been dethroned. This is the new thing. And then tomorrow there's probably going to be a new Llama model, or there's going to be a new Gemini model. And so there's a huge amount of, I don't think there's a Google yet amongst the LLM providers that has just won the battle.
Yeah.
But that being said, it is a piece of infrastructure. So I would imagine that over the course of the next, I don't know, like 2 years even, there is probably going to be a huge amount of consolidation around like, here are the 2 or 3 best ones. And now, in order to truly innovate beyond that, you have to go back to the drawing board for how these models were built in the first place, like using RLHF or using this huge amount of fine tuning or pre-training that was happening for these neural network-based models. And if there's a fundamental difference in the way these models are built out, that's going to lead to the huge next leapfrog.
Right.
But until then, it's going to continue to be this white hot market where people are just it's an arms race between these startups.
The closest example I think I could give you from my experience would just be on the end user side for image generation. I think, again, like you said, you've got people that have that list of 10 questions that they usually ask, that they throw out a new model, and so in my head, I have usually like 3 or 4 different image prompts that I throw at each different image generator, and I can then judge based on how close did you get to that crazy image that I came up with.
Yeah.
And then obviously with guardrails and things like that, that's a whole different conversation as well. And again, because we just had that discussion of the Elon Musk Grok AI generator that had basically no guardrails at all. So I don't think businesses want to go to that route. But again, I'm judging the popularity of that kind of stuff. I wanted to ask you another question about, you see a lot of companies that are coming in and discussing their AI project with you. How can you tell if a company is really serious? Like, do you have a bunch of, what are some of the red flags and green flags that tell you whether or not they are serious, or if they're just kind of fishing for some ideas or looking for some free advice from you?
Yeah, great questions. We actually have a maturity curve inside of Galileo where when our business development folks have a first conversation with them, they try to peg them on that maturity curve. And what we've seen is about, again, maybe we've been in this language model space for over 3.5 years at this point. So we've seen the entire evolution happen post GPT. What we saw about a year and a half ago was a lot of companies would come to us and tell us that this is amazing technology. We have 150 use cases for this across the entire organization. We did this hackathon and now everyone's excited about this. And then, at that point, still, that's not real, right? Like, which one of the 150 use cases would actually push the needle for you guys? And which ones are actually going to lead to huge amounts of cost optimizations or increase in revenue? And do you need a large language model for this? Those would be the questions where we would have to push them a lot before we actually worked with them. Versus now what we're seeing is people come to us and tell us that, look, we know that here are the three use cases that we've seen our competitors use, and it's already doing really well in the world of telco and the telecommunications, in the world of financial services, healthcare, retail. You've already seen a bunch of these use cases emerge way beyond chatbots at this point. And they basically come to us and say, like, we know here are the 5 use cases. We already have a team of AI engineers, software engineers, data scientists, PMs. Number 3, we've already bought our OpenAI key. We already have a couple of open source models that we have an eye on. Number 4, we already have, let's say, a RAG-based system or a fine-tuned model that we want to use. And number 5, we have a good sense for a timeline that we want to work within, because we need to launch this application by, let's say, the end of October. So if we hear those things, which you start to hear more and more from enterprises, that's when we say, fine, we're ready to engage, because we're all about making sure that you can build your AI applications much faster with the right kind of guardrails in place, pre and post production. And so that's where we want to be able to sit. And we're seeing increasingly the maturity curve of enterprises go towards the right.
Now, by the same measure, there's also a lot of stories lately about how end users are getting frustrated by some of these tools. They're not seeing the productivity gains that they were promised. There's a lot of hype and disillusionment coming that we're headed towards that trough. Now, I don't know how much you're involved in that, because it feels like you're still enthusiastic about these projects that companies are coming in and asking you to help them out with, and that's all good. But do you see the whirlwind of all of these stories, and does it concern you, or have companies actually told you, like, yeah, we tried this, it didn't work, we're a little bit hesitant? Where do you sit in this and I don't want to use I'm going to use it, the bubble bursting. Is this a real thing or not a real thing?
It absolutely had to burst. As soon as because like I said, we've been here before GPT. We were sitting in domain, the only cow in the pasture land, like focusing on this stuff, and we saw this huge bubble being generated around. I would call it the bubble of expectations, right?
The bubble of hype. The
bubble of hope that this is going to be it, and then there was fear as a result of that. There's going to be AGI, but at the end of the day, this is not necessarily net new technology. This was already there. It's just that compute caught up with things, and now we had the GPU prowess to do this because of NVIDIA, and so OpenAI managed to triple down on this and build this massive model, a massive version of BERT, let's say, that could just work magically. And we always knew, if you were from the world of machine learning and AI, you always knew that if somebody does this, it's probably going to be pretty cool, and it was beyond our expectations. And when something like that happens, people go crazy, right? Like it's exactly the same thing that happened when the web became a thing, and everyone was like, aha, now every single brick and mortar company is going to come online, and I'm going to make it happen, and it's going to be great. If you're going to be buying cars from a dealer, now I'm going to sell you cars from the shop. But users aren't ready for that yet, so it's not going to happen. And so the same thing is going on, was going on with the world of generative AI as well, where there was a huge amount of hope. We saw a lot of people come to us in early 2023, late 2023, and tell us that, look, we're in this, we're real, but then it wouldn't go anywhere, right? It wouldn't necessarily go into production, because they would say, like, it's still, we work in the HR industry, let's say, and we do screening using LLMs, and it hallucinated on like 5 or 6 of these resumes, and it's biased. That's not good. And so we've seen that happen. So I would say, like, we've been in this trough of disillusionment now for the last few months at this point. And I think that's a great thing, because now people stop talking about how this is going to necessarily become AGI anytime soon. That's a great North Star to have. We're far away from that. It's just a large model, which is powerful, and it can be a very good tool for certain use cases. And people are realizing that there are increasingly more, instead of coming to us with 150 use cases, they're coming to us with like 5, 6. Now, I think that's a much more healthy way of doing things, rather than, thinking that this can just solve every single problem.
Yeah, I think the analogy I like to use is there's a lot of people at companies that have great ideas, and they're just be like idea, and then they send it to someone else, and they tell you, all right, well now you have to execute on this idea, and as you're executing on the ideas, all of these other obstacles and hurdles come up, and this great idea all of a sudden isn't as great of an idea, and I think that's what we're at now as people are trying and using it in applications and coming up with new scenarios, and they're finding the results are just not cool. They're sending that information back up to these idea people, and the idea people are going, oh, maybe this isn't as good as it was. But I think maybe to tamper our expectations a little bit and then move forward from there. It feels like that's where we're going to head. Yeah,
that's right. Exactly. And so we've seen some failures, we've seen some successes, but I think what's also important for people to note is it's not like it is real. Like, it is real technology, and there are real outcomes that have happened for real enterprises at scale. And so I think that's what's keeping the lights on for the world of AI. And people also realize that this is the first inning in the world of AI. And even in this first inning, if there are some such crazy real outcomes that we're seeing, like ServiceNow came out with this huge thing. I think it was 2 quarters ago, where their AI-based product was one of the fastest growing products they ever had. OpenAI has gotten to over 2 billion in ARR faster than any other company. It took Databricks 10 years to get there. It took them barely like a few years of having OpenAI. Anthropic, same thing, 2 billion in revenue. It is absolutely crazy what's happening in terms of the real usage by real users. And it's the first inning. So I think that's the piece which gets like folks like me excited about and very hopeful about what's going to happen. And I think it's a good thing that the bubble burst. I do think there's going to be another bubble that's going to happen as soon as the next big incredible model comes out that just can synthesize your text in real time, as an example. But we're going to keep going through these cycles.
Okay, so since I've got you on the discussion here, I wanted to ask you this, and this might be the dumbest question you've ever heard. So if it is, just tell me, okay? So we've noticed a lot of companies that are creating products that include multiple LLMs within their product. And so, for example, if a company you might be developing a chatbot, and this platform says, okay, well, I can grab the answer from OpenAI, I can grab it from, Anthropic, I can do Gemini, and then, for this question, here are the different answers you're going to get, and then you can decide whether, which one you want to use in your product. Okay. So they're integrating multiple LLMs within their platform. So my question is what can you mix LLMs to create a single answer? Is that possible, or is it not possible? Where you can only integrate them all, but you're going to get separate answers versus some kind of decision maker giving you the best answer.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's the most common architecture that you've seen out there. But that being said, we have seen some teams, I wouldn't say like mixing, I guess they have multiple LLMs as a part of the entire process. But it's, as an example, let's take an example of like the contact center, right? Where there's a user that comes in and says like, I hate this product and I want a replacement. And what you want to do is 2 things. You want to make sure that first you want to use an LLM to maybe figure out, to classify that as, is this person asking for a replacement? Is this person asking for a refund or something else? So that's more of a classifier use case. And then once you figure out that this is actually a refund use case, you want to send that to a fine-tuned LLM, which is specifically good at generating a response for refunds. And so you might have multiple LLMs in the loop to do different kinds of things. We've definitely seen that.
Okay.
In there, I would also argue that you probably don't need a large language model most of the time for those kinds of things. It could be a smaller language model, like a BERT model initially. But we are seeing people use multiple LLMs in the loop for different kinds of pieces. Not all of them are for the end generation piece. Some of them are just for the router or the classifier, the piece of it. So we are definitely seeing people who have those kinds of architectures. I will say it's still so expensive to use like an LLM as compared to just, let's say, an open source BERT model. it's a little bit more rare to see multiple LLMs being used in the loop. People try to gravitate towards just one or two that they want to use.
Yeah, I guess another analogy I just thought of was this this idea of a consensus pick. So sometimes when with sporting events, like so let's say the Patriots are playing the Jets, ahead of the game, you see a chart that says, all right, here's our 10 analysts that we have from our our pregame show, some of these other writers, some of the people that follow the team, and they all pick the team that they want. And so you know, Patriots Jets, maybe you get like 7 Patriots, 3 Jets, but the consensus is that the Patriots. And again, these are just predictions. So is there something similar that could happen in the AI space where you have it, or is that only going to happen maybe in a prediction model versus where you're asking the question of what's the capital of France? You're hoping that all the answers say Paris, correct? And I'm glad you actually told me that the capital of France is Paris. I was a little worried that we didn't know that answer.
Well, I think the thing with enterprise use cases though is you can't rely on hope as much from these models, because if it's wrong, then things can be really bad from a PR perspective.
Yeah.
Like if this is Google search and you're asking it what's the capital of France and it says Washington DC, it's toast, right? Like the stock is going to go down, it's going to be really bad. So that's where before you even put that out there into production, it's similar to software engineering where you just have to do a lot of quality checks. And typically in software engineering, quality checks just include like thinking of like 100 different scenarios in which this thing could be used or broken and trying them all out internally before you actually put that out in production. That's typically how QC works. It's similar in concept, again, where people have to just think about, for my use case, I could have these 100, 500 different kinds of queries, and these are the things that users might ask.
Yep.
And then try to see how the model responds to that, how that entire stack responds to that. And that's super important to do before you actually put this out there. And that's where, again, you have to look at the different models, you have to look at the different parameters you have. Are you allowing the model to be super creative? Are you trying to reduce the temperature so that it's not super creative?
Yeah.
There's different aspects to this. How much do you want to ground this in the knowledge that you have? How often is the model actually going outside of syllabus and looking at something else? So that's a lot of the work that needs to be done before you put this out there. And so that's been something that we've been seeing a lot of any AI application developer actually starting to embrace more and more and understand that this AI evaluation that needs to happen is actually really, really important part of the AI software stack at this point.
All right. So one final question I want to ask you. We are kind of coming up on our time. And so where do you see a lot of the LLMs kind of evolving in the next year or so? Are we finally done with the development of all of these LLMs, or are we going to start seeing, where we then start seeing fine tuning? And you're already seeing that with some of the big models or some of the early models. That's like, we've got version 2, version 3, version 4, et cetera. Or do you still think that there's a lot of room left for new LLMs that could come to the market? And, maybe if we have 30 now, like next year when you come on the show, there'll be 300 or there'll be less, like where eventually you got to slow down, right? You can't, or maybe not. I don't know. What's your thoughts on that?
I don't think it's going to slow down. I think it's just getting started. It's kind of like, the first airplane was just built out. People loved it. But 100 years later, here we are still building newer kinds of airplanes, and the Boeing is here. So I think we just are getting started. I think what's going to happen in a year from now is you will have the total number of models will be larger, but if you look at the top 10, top 20 models, it'll maybe look very different than it does today. Because some folks are going to come up with a newer way of building LLMs altogether. There are already some startups that are working on that, because RLHF, reinforcement learning with human feedback is very expensive. There's some companies that are working on real reinforcement learning with AI feedback. And so there's ways to reduce the cost. So there's a lot of innovation that's happening under the hood of how you build these LLMs, which I think is going to make a very big difference. I think it's just getting started, to be honest, and we've only been just scratching the surface of this. People still talk about how it's expensive, and so the cost is going to come dramatically down. And when we talk a year from now, it's going to be a much more exciting space, in my opinion. We'll be talking much more about image generation and speech generation, and how how there's text to speech and text to image happening much more, and everything is so much cheaper now. And imagine the number of applications that you can build with that. So I think we're just getting started with all of this.
Always good to have a tech optimist on the show. You kind of you balance off my tech pessimism from reading all these stories all the time. Vikram Chatterjee, again, thank you very much for being on the show today, and great conversation. I loved having you on the show. Thanks.
Of course. Thanks so much, Keith.
That's all the time we have for today's episode. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, add any thoughts you have below in the comments. Join us every week for new episodes of Today in Tech. I'm Keith Shaw. Thanks for watching.